When the mask finally cracks and the noise fades, what's left isn't weakness, it's truth. And truth, stripped of pretense and performance, is the beginning of real transformation. Silence exposes truth where hysteria hides. When someone becomes hysterical, when emotions spiral into accusation, tears, or dramatic expression, there's often something underneath that isn't being said, something concealed behind the noise. Hysteria functions as a shield. It draws attention away from the real issue by overwhelming the space with sound and emotion. It's a defense mechanism, a desperate attempt to control perception, to shape reality through intensity rather than honesty. But silence, real, deliberate silence, cuts straight through that. It doesn't compete. It doesn't justify. It doesn't engage in the theater of emotion. It just sits there, unflinching, and in that stillness, truth begins to rise from underneath the performance. People use hysteria to avoid facing what they can't bear to acknowledge. When you raise your voice, when you dramatize, when you flood the environment with emotion, you drown out the quiet voice of conscience that's whispering something you don't want to hear. But silence, especially the silence of someone who refuses to be drawn into the performance, makes that voice impossible to ignore. It magnifies what hysteria tries to bury. That's why silence is so uncomfortable. For those who thrive on chaos, it leaves them face to face with themselves. There's something almost surgical about silence. It cuts away pretense without aggression. It doesn't fight, it doesn't accuse. But it reveals. When someone refuses to react, when they don't feed the emotional escalation, the manipulative structure collapses under its own contradictions. You can't sustain falsehood without attention. The hysterical outburst feeds on energy, and when that energy is denied, the illusion starts to flicker. The truth begins to seep through the cracks, the insecurity, the fear, the guilt, the unspoken pain. Silence makes all of that visible without a single word being said. And this isn't just about others, it's about you. When you remain silent in the face of hysteria, you're also confronted by truth, your own truth. You have to face the discomfort of not defending yourself, of not explaining, of not controlling the narrative. That's a test of maturity, because silence isn't passive, it's restraint. It's choosing not to respond out of impulse, but out of understanding. It's the discipline to stand still while the storm rages around you, trusting that truth doesn't need you to shout for it to exist. Most people can't handle that kind of silence because it demands integrity. It forces you to confront your motivations. Are you silent because you're afraid, or because you know that engaging would only perpetuate the lie? Real silence, the kind that exposes truth, is born from clarity, not avoidance. It's the silence of someone who knows what's real and refuses to be drawn into distortion. In every interaction where hysteria arises, there's a moment where you can either react or remain grounded, and that decision determines whether the truth emerges or stays buried. If you react, you feed the performance. If you stay silent, you call its bluff. Silence doesn't destroy truth, it reveals it. Hysteria can hide behind words, but it can't survive in the presence of stillness. Emotional manipulation loses power without reaction. Manipulation thrives on energy, on the transfer of attention, empathy, guilt, or anger from one person to another. It's a psychological transaction that requires your participation. When someone attempts to manipulate you, they're not just expressing emotion, they're testing control. They're probing to see whether they can move you, whether they can shape your perception or behavior through emotional leverage. The moment you react, whether by defending, explaining, or retaliating, you give them what they want, engagement. But when you withhold reaction, when you meet manipulation with calm, the entire mechanism falters. It's like cutting power to a machine. It sputters, then stops. Manipulators use emotional expression as currency. They invest in outbursts, guilt trips, passive aggression, or victimhood, expecting a return in the form of compliance or emotional labor. They need you to feel responsible for their state of mind. That's how control is maintained, through the illusion that your peace is dependent on their approval. But this illusion only exists if you agree to the exchange. When you don't react, when you don't buy into the narrative, you reveal that their emotion doesn't determine your reality, and that's when manipulation begins to lose its grip. There's a certain kind of power that comes from refusing to be moved by someone else's emotional storm. It's not coldness, it's clarity. It's knowing the difference between compassion and control. You can care about someone's pain without surrendering your boundaries to it. You can listen without absorbing. You can observe without being pulled into the spiral. This is where emotional maturity begins, in the recognition that your reaction is your choice. Manipulation relies on predictability. It depends on the assumption that you will react in a certain way, that you'll defend when accused, comfort when guilted, chase when withdrawn. Once you break that pattern, once you stop responding on cue, the manipulator loses their map. They no longer know where to step next. That's when their behavior either escalates or collapses, because the familiar game no longer works. And in that confusion, the truth begins to show that their actions were never about connection or understanding, but about control. Remaining calm under manipulation isn't easy. It requires you to regulate your own instincts, to resist the pull toward justification or emotional retaliation. Your silence and composure become acts of defiance, not hostile defiance, but principled restraint. Every time you withhold reaction, you reclaim a piece of your agency. You show that your emotional state is not at the mercy of someone else's volatility. You stop being a character in their story and return to being the author of your own. This is the paradox. Manipulators seek to control you through emotion, but the moment you master your emotional response, the control evaporates. It doesn't require confrontation or grand statements. It requires presence, awareness, and the decision to not play the part written for you. Emotional manipulation cannot survive in an environment where reactions are deliberate rather than automatic, where peace isn't something to be stolen, but something you protect through discipline. Calmness is moral courage, not weakness. It takes far more strength to remain steady in the face of provocation than it does to retaliate. Calmness is not the absence of emotion, it is mastery over it. It is a form of moral discipline, a declaration that your behavior will not be dictated by chaos. In a world that glorifies outrage, where every disagreement becomes a performance and every feeling demands immediate expression, calmness has become almost radical. It represents the ability to think clearly when others lose themselves to impulse. It's not indifference, it's integrity under pressure. When you stay calm, you signal to yourself and to others that you are not ruled by circumstance. You acknowledge emotion without becoming enslaved by it. People often mistake that composure for coldness because they can't imagine strength that doesn't shout. But true power doesn't need to prove itself through volume or aggression. It's quiet, grounded, and deliberate. Calmness in the midst of turmoil is a refusal to let the external world define your internal state. It's the act of standing still in a storm, not because you're numb, but because you know that being swept away serves no one. Moral courage lies in restraint. Anyone can react when provoked. Few can remain principled. Calmness is the embodiment of that principle. It means holding on to your values even when emotion tempts you to abandon them. It means recognizing that how you respond says more about your character than what's being said to you. In every conflict, there's a moment, a flash, when you can either escalate or pause. That pause is sacred. It's where freedom exists. The person who can inhabit that pause, who can think before responding, is the one who governs themselves. Calmness also demands trust. Trust that truth doesn't need to be shouted to be real, that time and clarity will do their work. People who are reactive often believe that silence or composure means surrender, that if they don't fight back immediately, they'll lose control of the situation, but that's an illusion. The more you react, the more you hand over control to the chaos. The calmer you are, the more authority you retain. Calmness doesn't mean you accept injustice. It means you respond strategically instead of impulsively. It's the difference between a soldier panicking in battle and a commander assessing the field before moving. There's a dignity in calmness, a quiet assertion of self-respect. You stop negotiating with hysteria, stop trading truth for approval. You learn to stand within your own space, not to dominate others, but to remain uncorrupted by their instability. This form of composure often unnerves people because it cannot be manipulated. Those who thrive on emotional volatility lose their footing when faced with unwavering calm. They depend on your reaction to sustain their power, and when you refuse to give it, they confront the limits of their influence. Calmness, then, is not submission but sovereignty. It's what happens when you refuse to mirror chaos, when you decide that peace is not a prize to be won through conflict, but a posture maintained through courage. If this resonated with you, hit subscribe and stay with us on this journey of truth and transformation. Your growth begins where the noise ends. Join the movement. The storm of chaos breaks against steadfast stillness. Chaos by its nature seeks movement. It thrives on reaction, on friction, on the constant back and forth that keeps confusion alive. When people are caught in chaos, emotional, relational, or psychological, they instinctively look for something to push against, something to pull into the swirl. They need that resistance to sustain the storm. But when they encounter stillness, when they meet someone who refuses to be moved, the dynamic begins to shift. The storm loses its rhythm because it cannot find a foothold in calm. The more still you remain, the more the chaos turns in on itself until it burns out. Stillness doesn't mean passivity. It's an active state of control, a choice to hold your ground in the midst of turbulence. When you remain calm and grounded, you become like a rock in the current. Everything flows around you, but you remain unmoved. That stability unsettles those who rely on conflict to maintain significance. People who live in perpetual chaos are accustomed to dragging others into their emotional gravity, but when you don't respond, when you stand steady, their usual tactics lose force. The storm crashes, but you stand. That's what breaks it. The power of stillness lies in presence. It's not withdrawal, it's awareness. When everything around you feels like it's collapsing, when emotions surge and voices rise, stillness gives you space to see clearly. You begin to discern what's real from what's noise. Most of what we call chaos isn't real. It's fear, insecurity, and misunderstanding amplified through reaction. When you stop contributing to that cycle, you strip chaos of its energy source. It's a strange kind of strength because it feels counterintuitive. Everything in you wants to move, to speak, to defend, to do something, but stillness demands that you times don't asterisk. It asks you to trust that reaction is not resolution. The still person in the storm becomes a mirror. Their presence reflects the instability around them, revealing its futility. When someone shouts and you don't respond, they begin to hear the emptiness of their own echo. When they accuse and you don't retaliate, they confront their own words without the distraction of your defense. This reflection is uncomfortable, sometimes even unbearable, because it forces truth into view. Stillness breaks chaos, not through resistance, but through exposure. It shows people what their own energy looks like when it has nowhere to land. Maintaining that stillness, however, requires inner discipline. It demands emotional regulation, clarity of purpose, and a commitment to peace that surpasses the immediate satisfaction of retaliation. You have to know who you are, or you'll get swept into every storm that calls your name. Stillness isn't natural, it's learned. It's cultivated through failure, through moments when you did react and saw the cost of it. Each time you choose stillness over chaos, you strengthen that muscle, and eventually it becomes instinctual. The storm will always come. People will always bring their noise, their drama, their projections, but the storm only has as much power as you give it. When you stay still, anchored in truth, grounded in self-control, the chaos crashes, shatters, and eventually dissolves against the wall of your composure. Transformation begins when performance collapses. As long as people are performing, acting out of ego, fear, or the need for validation, no real change can take place. Performance is the armor that protects the fragile parts of the self, the parts that can't bear to be seen as weak, wrong, or vulnerable. It's a mask built from pretense and maintained through constant effort. But that mask consumes energy, and eventually it cracks. The moment it does, when the illusion falters and the performance no longer holds, something profoundly human is revealed underneath. That's where transformation begins, not in perfection, but in exposure. The collapse of performance is rarely graceful. It often comes with humiliation, with emotional exhaustion, with the painful realization that the role you've been playing no longer works. People resist it because it feels like death, the death of who they thought they were, or needed to be, to survive. But every act of genuine growth starts with that collapse. You can't evolve while pretending. You can't heal while maintaining a lie. When the performance breaks, what's left is the raw material of truth, the real self. Unedited, uncertain, but honest. Transformation requires honesty more than comfort. When you stop performing, you lose control over how you're perceived. That's terrifying for anyone who's built their identity around approval. The world might see you differently. People might withdraw. But what you gain in that loss is authenticity. And authenticity has a power that performance can never imitate. It's solid, rooted in reality rather than image. It doesn't need to be defended because it simply times is asterisk. When you stop pretending to be perfect, you allow yourself to actually become better. The breaking of performance also exposes motives. You start to see why you did what you did, why you exaggerated, why you manipulated, why you sought attention or validation. Those behaviors weren't random. They were attempts to hide fear. And when you see that clearly, when you understand that much of what you presented to the world was a defense against rejection, you begin to forgive yourself. That forgiveness is the soil in which transformation grows. Without it, you'll only trade one mask for another. Performance collapses in silence because silence doesn't play along. When no one reacts, when no one feeds the act, the performance becomes unsustainable. The histrionic energy that once felt powerful starts to feel hollow. That's the moment of reckoning, when the person realizes that noise can't substitute for truth. It's painful to watch and even more painful to experience, but that collapse is sacred. It's the breaking open of the false self, the crumbling of illusion that makes room for integrity. Real transformation isn't about becoming something new, it's about returning to what's real beneath all the layers of adaptation. It's rediscovering the strength that comes from honesty, the peace that comes from not having to perform. When the performance ends, life stops being an act of survival and becomes an act of becoming. That's where depth begins, when there's nothing left to maintain, and what remains is finally true.